Russia is burning its own credibility, not metaphorically, literally and strategically, in the hours before the most symbolically loaded date on the Russian military calendar. Let that sit for a moment. May 9th, Victory Day, the day Vladimir Putin stands on Red Square and projects the image of an undefeated Russian state, continuous from 1945 to the present. The day the Kremlin's entire narrative architecture depends on the appearance of strength, control, and historical momentum. And in the 72 hours before that carefully choreographed spectacle, Ukraine launched one of the most consequential strike packages of the entire war. Not because the timing was symbolic, though it was, but because Ukraine had already done the strategic calculation that Russia refused to do. Russia was offered a ceasefire. Russia rejected it. And Ukraine's response was not diplomatic protest, it was ordnance. This is not a story about escalation for its own sake. This is a case study in what happens when one side's political assumptions become structurally incompatible with its military realities, and the other side is disciplined enough to exploit that gap at exactly the right moment. What you are witnessing right now is not a tactical exchange around a symbolic holiday. It is the latest confirmation of a pattern that has been accumulating since the first week of this war. Russia mistakes theater for strategy, and Ukraine keeps making Russia pay for that confusion. Before this analysis is finished, you will understand not just what happened in those hours before May 9th, but why it was always going to happen, and what it tells us about where this war is actually heading at the structural level. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. To understand why Russia's ceasefire rejection was not just a diplomatic miscalculation, but a compounding military error, you have to go back to the assumption set that has governed Russian decision-making from the beginning, and which has been wrong in almost every dimension that matters. Russia entered this war believing several things simultaneously. It believed that speed and mass would substitute for doctrine. It believed that the Ukrainian state would fracture under pressure before Western support could consolidate. It believed that symbolic control of territory, Kyiv in the first days, Mariupol by May 2022, Bakhmut 2 years later, would translate into negotiating leverage that would eventually force a settlement on Russian terms. And underlying all of those beliefs was a deeper assumption, the one that has proven most costly, that time was on Russia's side. The ceasefire offer that Russia received and rejected in early May 2026 did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived after months of Ukrainian drone and missile pressure that had systematically degraded Russian rear area infrastructure, oil refineries, ammunition depots, command nodes, airfields, at a rate and geographic depth that Russian air defense had demonstrably failed to contain. It arrived after Ukraine had shown, repeatedly and with increasing precision, that the supposed sanctuaries inside Russian territory were no longer sanctuaries at all. And it arrived on the eve of the one date that matters most to the Kremlin's domestic political theater. Russia's rejection of that ceasefire was framed publicly as a principled refusal to negotiate under pressure. That is the Kremlin's narrative. Here's the military reality. Russia rejected the ceasefire because accepting it would have required acknowledging battlefield conditions that contradict everything the Russian state has told its own population. A ceasefire accepted before May 9th would have been impossible to stage as victory. A ceasefire rejected gave Russia the appearance of resolve. The problem is that appearances do not stop Ukrainian precision munitions from finding their targets. In Ukraine, having received the answer it apparently expected, responded with exactly the kind of strike package that turns a diplomatic moment into a doctrinal statement. The first mistake was not tactical, it was psychological. Russia chose the optics of the parade over the logic of the battlefield, and Ukraine made them pay for that choice before the parade even began. Pull the lens back to approximately 6 weeks before May 9th, and you can trace the operational runway that Ukraine was building toward this strike window. Ukrainian long-range drone operations had been escalating in scope, geographic reach, and target selection throughout March and April. What began as opportunistic strikes against fuel infrastructure gradually evolved into something more deliberate, a systematic campaign against the Russian military's logistical nervous system in the western oblasts of Russia itself: Kursk, Belgorod, Bryansk, Voronezh, Rostov. These are not frontline areas. These are the areas Russia assumed were beyond routine Ukrainian reach. That assumption was being revised strike by strike throughout the spring. The numbers here are important, and they are not small. Ukrainian drone forces launched what defense analysts assessed as the largest coordinated multi-axis strike package against Russian territory since the start of the full-scale invasion, involving over 200 long-range strike drones in a single operational window targeted against at least 11 separate facilities across 5 Russian oblasts. 11 facilities, 5 oblasts, 1 operational window. That is not opportunism. That is planning. Among the confirmed or assessed targets in the May pre-9th strike sequence, a fuel depot in the Krasnodar region assessed to supply a significant portion of the fuel pipeline servicing Russian forces in the southern axis, a rail marshalling yard in Bryansk Oblast that serves as a critical node for ammunition resupply toward the Kursk and Sumy directions, an airfield perimeter facility in Rostov assessed to house support infrastructure for Russian fixed-wing strike operations against Ukrainian rear areas, and multiple command and communications relay nodes whose destruction degrades the real-time coordination capacity of Russian artillery groupings across a 400-kilometer front. What happens next changes everything about how you should read the Russian ceasefire rejection, because here is the hidden military variable that most news coverage is missing entirely. The timing of Ukraine's strike package was not chosen because of the symbolic calendar. The timing was chosen because Russian air defense assets in the western Oblast belt had been progressively repositioned over the preceding 6 weeks, not to defend Russian territory, but to thicken air defense coverage over Moscow and other major population centers in advance of May 9th security protocols. Russia chose to protect the parade. Ukraine chose to strike the logistics. That is an asymmetry of priority that has strategic consequences that extend well beyond a single strike night. Let me be precise about what the doctrine gap looks like when you strip away the headline. Russia's air defense system is not unlimited. It is a finite network of platforms, S-400, S-300, Panzer, that requires deliberate positioning to cover priority areas. When Russia chose to thicken air defense over Moscow and St. Petersburg for the Victory Day period, it was making an explicit choice. The symbolic political centers matter more than the logistical operating infrastructure in the Western Oblast. That is a rational choice from a regime survival perspective. It is a disastrous choice from a military operational perspective. Ukraine's targeting planners are not naive. They read Russian repositioning through their intelligence picture, through signals, through satellite imagery, through human reporting, through the kind of persistent pattern analysis that any serious military intelligence apparatus maintains on a near real-time basis. When Ukraine's planners saw Russian air defense thinning out in the western Oblast belt, they did not interpret that as a Ukrainian opportunity of convenience. They interpreted it as a Ukrainian operational window created by Russian political prioritization. Russia handed Ukraine a targeting gift. Ukraine used it. The broader lesson here is one that goes to the heart of why Russia keeps losing the adaptation race. Russia has a military designed for a world in which the front and the rear are clearly separated, in which rear areas are sanctuaries, and in which strategic depth provides automatic protection from adversary action. That model of warfare was already under pressure in the early Cold War. In 2024 and 2025, it has been operationally invalidated by the combination of Ukrainian long-range drones, precision strike munitions, and a targeting architecture that has no meaningful frontline boundary. Russia has not yet produced a doctrinal response to this reality. It has produced political responses, diplomatic responses, and rhetorical responses. But at the level of air defense architecture, logistics protection, and rear area security, Russia is still fighting the war it expected rather than the war Ukraine is actually waging. And it gets even more serious from here. step back to the industrial level, because that is where the compounding logic of Ukraine's pre-May 9th strike package becomes fully visible. Russia's war economy is under structural strain that its propagandists do not acknowledge and its military planners cannot solve through rhetoric. The Institute for the Study of War and multiple Western defense intelligence assessments have converged on a picture that Russia's defense industrial base, while having ramped production in key categories, is simultaneously facing critical bottlenecks in precision components, in skilled technical labor, and in the logistical bandwidth required to move materiel from production centers to forward positions at the volume the front demands. The fuel depot strike near Krasnodar is not a symbolic gesture. Fuel is the operating medium of combined arms warfare. Russian armored and mechanized operations require fuel at scale. When you strike a fuel node that services Southern Axis operations, you are not creating a temporary disruption. You are forcing Russian logistical planners to reroute supply lines, increasing delivery times, increasing truck hours, increasing exposure to Ukrainian interdiction along alternate routes, and critically, degrading the operational tempo of Russian ground forces at exactly the moment when Russia is attempting to maintain pressure across multiple axes simultaneously. The rail marshalling yard strike in Bryansk is even more consequential at the systemic level. Russia relies on its rail network for heavy ammunition resupply in a way that has no easy alternative. Trucks can carry fuel. Trucks cannot efficiently carry the volume of artillery ammunition that Russian fire doctrine demands. When you degrade the rail network's throughput capacity, you are degrading Russian artillery firing rates, and Russian artillery is the primary instrument through which Russia currently imposes costs on Ukrainian defensive positions. Degrade the ammunition flow and you degrade the fire rate. Degrade the fire rate and you degrade the operational pressure Russia can sustain. Ukraine is not just striking targets. Ukraine is engineering a logistics degradation cascade, and the timing deliberately selected for the window when Russian air defense coverage was thinnest in the oblasts that matter most for Western resupply routes reflects a level of operational integration that Russia has consistently underestimated throughout this war. The real question is not whether these individual strikes were successful. The real question is whether Russia has a structural answer to an adversary that has demonstrated the persistent capacity to strike at will into what Russia calls its strategic depth. And the evidence of the last 18 months says clearly that Russia does not. Now let me walk you through the climactic operation in this pre-May 9th sequence, because this is where the full strategic picture crystallizes into something that should change how every Western observer thinks about the trajectory of this war. On the night of May 7th into May 8th, Ukraine launched what Ukrainian military sources described, and which OSINT tracking confirmed, as a multi-wave strike operation involving both long-range Shahed-type drones operating in swarm configurations and Ukrainian-developed long-range ballistic and cruise munitions, including assets from the expanded domestic production lines that Ukraine has been quietly scaling over the preceding 12 months. The operation targeted 3 categories of assets simultaneously: logistics infrastructure, air defense support facilities, and significantly radar and communications nodes associated with Russian long-range aviation operations. That third category is the one that matters most doctrinally. Russia's long-range aviation, its Tu-95 Bear bombers, its Tu-22M backfires operating at standoff range, has been the platform through which Russia delivers its Kh-101 cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. Those platforms operate from airfields deep inside Russia. They are vectored to their launch windows using a communications and radar architecture that links command centers in the Russian interior to the aircraft and to forward assessment of Ukrainian air defenses. When you strike the communications and radar nodes that support that launch control architecture, you are not just destroying a piece of equipment, you are degrading the integrated system through which Russia projects strategic air power against Ukrainian territory. Ukraine hit 3 such nodes in the May 7th, 8th window. 3 nodes in a single night. The operational meaning of that is significant. Russian long-range aviation has already reduced its sortie rate over the preceding 6 weeks due to a combination of Ukrainian air defense improvements, F-16 employment, and the attrition of precision munition stocks. Degrading the command and control nodes that support those remaining sorties forces Russia to either reduce sortie rates further or accept higher operational risk to its airframe and crew assets. Here is the counterintuitive reframe that most coverage is missing. Ukraine did not strike those radar and communications nodes to stop a specific Russian missile attack. Ukraine struck them to impose a structural tax on Russia's ability to threaten Ukrainian infrastructure in every subsequent week and month. This is not a reactive defense. This is preemptive campaign logic, using a tactical window to impose strategic level costs. That is the doctrinal evolution that defines this phase of the war. Ukraine is no longer reacting to Russian strategic air campaigns. Ukraine is systematically dismantling the infrastructure that makes those campaigns possible. And Russia, despite 3 years of facing this kind of adaptive pressure, has not found a way to protect that infrastructure from an adversary operating drones and precision munitions at the depth and scale Ukraine has now demonstrated. Let that sink in for a moment. 3 years, and Russia still does not have a structural answer. Pull the lens all the way back now, because the May 9th context is not just military. It is the place where the political theater of Russian state power collides with the operational reality of Russian military failure. And that collision has consequences that extend well beyond a single parade or a single strike sequence. Vladimir Putin will stand on Red Square on May 9th and deliver a speech about Russian historical continuity, about the unbroken thread from 1945 to the present, about the state's commitment to the security of the Russian people. He will do this while Ukrainian drones have just struck 11 facilities across 5 Russian oblasts. He will do this while Russian fuel and ammunition logistics have been degraded in the weeks preceding the most scrutinized military calendar date of the year. He will do this while the ceasefire offer his government rejected has generated a documented Ukrainian strike response that has been covered by every major Western outlet. The audience for that speech inside Russia will be told that Russia is winning. The audience watching from outside will have access to a very different set of facts. And here is the strategic consequence of that divergence. It accelerates the erosion of the diplomatic space that Russia needs to achieve a negotiated outcome on terms it could present domestically as anything other than defeat. Russia's rejection of the ceasefire was not only a military miscalculation, it was a strategic trap that Russia set for itself. By rejecting the offer publicly on the eve of Victory Day, the Kremlin signaled that the political symbolism of the moment outweighed the military logic of pausing the attrition that is grinding down Russian ground forces. By accepting the consequent Ukrainian strike response, Russia demonstrated that its refusal to negotiate has a real and measurable military cost, not a hypothetical one. This matters enormously for what comes next. The Western capitals watching this sequence, Washington, London, Berlin, Warsaw, are not watching a symbolic exchange around a holiday. They are watching a demonstration that Ukraine can set the terms of military pressure even when Russia refuses to accept the terms of diplomatic engagement. That changes the calculus around future support packages. That changes the argument for sustaining and expanding Ukrainian long-range strike capability. That changes the political feasibility of continued Western investment in Ukrainian defense, because it demonstrates operationally that the investment is producing results. Here is my verdict, and I will give it to you plainly. Russia's rejection of the ceasefire offer before May 9th was not a display of strength. It was a revelation of structural weakness dressed in the costume of resolve. A state that genuinely believed it was winning a war of attrition would have no reason to fear a ceasefire offer. It would accept on terms favorable to its position, or it would use the diplomatic moment to consolidate gains. Russia did neither. It rejected because accepting would have required acknowledging, and acknowledging would have undermined the domestic performance on which the regime's legitimacy depends. Ukraine responded the only way that made military and strategic sense, with strikes timed to a window of maximum Russian vulnerability against targets that degrade Russian operational capacity in ways that compound over weeks and months, using an operational architecture that Russia has now spent 3 years failing to neutralize. What we are watching is not two sides trading blows around a holiday. What we are watching is the systematic exposure of a military doctrine, the Russian model of mass, depth, and political theater as strategy, failing against an adversary that has bet everything on adaptation, precision, and the willingness to strike at the logic of the opponent's system rather than simply at its bodies and equipment. History will record this phase of the war not as a stalemate, not as a frozen conflict, and not as a Russian war of attrition that time was inevitably going to resolve in Moscow's favor. History will record it as the period in which Ukraine demonstrated, strike by strike, night by night, that the assumptions on which Russia built its war were wrong, and that Russia, having built an entire political architecture around those assumptions, could not afford to acknowledge the error, even when the operational evidence was landing on its own territory. The parade will happen. The speech will be delivered. The flags will wave over Red Square. And the questions that matter, whether Russia's logistics network can absorb another 6 months of this level of Ukrainian strike pressure, whether the ammunition and fuel flows that sustain Russian ground operations can survive continued interdiction at this depth, whether the air defense architecture protecting Russian strategic aviation can withstand continued Ukrainian targeting, those questions do not have answers that the Kremlin wants anyone to hear. Stay with us, because those answers are being written right now, not in diplomatic communiques, but in the targeting logs of Ukrainian strike planners who have already read Russia's assumptions more clearly than Russia has read its own,